Tribe, Frenic here. So today on this course we're going to be talking about dynamic effects, and in particular we're going to be using this new plugin from Signum Audio called SKYE Dynamics. So the aims of this session are, first of all, we're just going to discuss what dynamics are, what dynamic effects are. We'll look at SKYE Dynamics features, and we'll talk about how the compressor, expander and limiter work. And then I'm going to give you a practical demonstration of how to utilize these dynamic effects within your own sound design and mixing. So what are dynamic effects? So essentially, dynamics are the difference between the loud and quiet parts of your track or a piece of audio. So types of dynamic effects you might find are compressors, expanders, limiters, noise gates, transient shapers, and all forms of kind of multi-band, things like multi-band compression as well. All of these dynamic effects all affect volume in different ways. So SKYE Dynamics is as it says, a dynamic plugin. And it contains a compressor, it contains an expander, and it contains a limiter, all within one plugin. And they run from the expander to the compressor, from the expander to the compressor to the limiter. So what is compression? So a compression essentially is going to turn down any signal that passes the set threshold. And this little diagram here, you can see that this is this green line representing, let's say, a transient from a drum, maybe a kick drum or a snare. You can see the red line being the threshold. Now with no compression, you can see how that transient pokes up past the threshold. But with the threshold and the ratio turned up, there you can see how it turns down the louder part of the audio. An expander, on the other hand, essentially is, it's the opposite of compression in a way. The expander then will turn down parts that are below the threshold. So again, if you look at the diagram, no expansion, and there's some downward expansion, making the quieter bits even quieter, if not totally turning them off. It works similar to a noise gate. And then we have the limiter. Now here, the limiter is essentially, it's a compressor, a limiter, but it has an infinite ratio. So what that means is, rather than how a compressor will ride the signal that's coming in, so depending how much signal comes into the threshold is how much the compressor will turn it down. A limiter will just set a flat limit and no audio can go past that point. Again, you can see on my diagram here, downward compression has turned down the signal, but still can peak above the threshold, whereas the limiting, as sometimes called a brick wall limiter, you can see totally cuts off the top of the audio. So that's why you've got to be careful with limiters, because they can cause distortion when used in too much extreme. Okay then, let's have a little look at using SKYE Dynamics and these dynamic effects practically in some musical examples. Okay, so let's have a little look at the compressor first. So I've got a little demonstration set up here. What I've done is I've triggered a little hi-hat to a noise gate in Ableton, and you can see I bring my threshold into here. Here's my little hi-hat sort of sidechain input happening, and what I'm doing is I'm sidechaining it to some white noise. So as I bring my threshold down on my gate here, it's going to let through a little bit of white noise. We've got an oscilloscope here on the right to demonstrate what's coming out. And if I open up the release on my gate here, we can sort of, make a kind of faux snare. And the reason I'm doing this is so we can demonstrate how the compressor, in this case, is going to affect a signal. So, for example, of a snare drum, right? That, so no, it doesn't sound exactly like a snare, but it's going to really give us a good sort of visual demonstration to what the compressor's doing here on our SKYE Dynamics plugin. So as you can see, I've got compressor selected here, and we've got controls for the compressor across here, but you can also use the nodes that are in the relative colour. So the compressor here is in green, so they're the compressor controls. You see if I hit expander, the yellow controls, and limiter is the purple, this fella up here. So we're going to be on the compressor. So let's see what this compressor does to the signal. Okay, so what we need for this compressor to work is we need to have some ratio. Okay, so I'm going to turn the ratio up. What I'm going to do here is just put the settings pretty extreme so we can see like what it's doing. Essentially, the ratio, you can kind of think of it as how much compression is going to happen, how much it's going to turn it down, depending on how much signal goes past the threshold. So I'm going to turn it right up so we've got a lot of ratio there. And then I'm going to bring this threshold down. Like I said, you can see the ratio change on the graph, so I could grab here as well to change my ratio on the screen tab. Now we can see our signals coming up to about here, so if I bring the threshold down past that point, look and kind of listen what happens. If you look at and you hear audibly that has turned down the signal quite a lot, and you can see how the shape of this kind of faux snare has really changed, hasn't it? You can see it's flattening off this transient. You know, it's making this sound less dynamic. It's more even. Let's just do it a little bit more extreme. Have a look. So check that out. You know, there we're getting something very flat. And what we've got at the moment, we've got this set to auto mode. So you can see how the auto mode there is on the release is attempting to give us a nice tail for the signal we're putting into it. Now, of course, if I've compressed my snare this much, I'd want to turn it up, and that's really what your makeup gain's for here. So I can actually turn up the gain on this meter on the right. This will give us a much louder signal. But as you can see, that's really heavily compressed, isn't it? Really kind of lost that shape of a snare. Now what you do if we're trying to shape this transient for a snare drum, for example, is what we're going to do is open up the attack stage to let through some signal that isn't compressed, which will basically be louder. So let's have a look and listen as I open up my attack stage here. You can hear that and see it on the oscilloscope. Here is where I'm opening the attack up. So this little transient is uncompressed, and everything else after that point is being compressed. So we can open up a bit more, and you can hear that kind of click at the beginning. So that's how you can get a really nice attack onto your drums, in particularly kicks and snares, etc. And now the release is currently set to auto mode. Let's just turn that off a second, turn it on to manual, and we'll see how the release can, again, manage this tail. So watch as I change the release time here. And you can see this interesting shape, and this is quite unique to this SKYE Dynamics plugin. We've got different release curves, and that's currently set to transparent. Let's have a look at what linear looks like. And we've got natural. So look at the difference in tail shape we're creating there. Transparent, which we were on before, I think, weren't we? And smooth. So there you can see that smooth kind of tail we've created using the release and the smooth option. And then pumping is really going to accentuate this. As that release tail comes back. So hopefully that little demonstration really shows you how much control you can have over individual hits and really shape your drum sounds. So let's just quickly look at how the limiter will affect things. So I'm just going to back off these settings for now, so it's not compressing. Bring the threshold right up to the top, and here's, turn that down a little bit because now it's not being compressed, it's much louder. So here's our snare drum. Now watch as I bring the limiter threshold down. You can see the moment I pick up the limiter controls, it changes my controls down here, and we have actually got an attack and release on this limiter. If we've set our attack to 0, it's effectively a brick wall limiter, so everything's going to be sort of stopped in its tracks above the threshold, and let's just have a look at that. So as we come down, you can see that the limiter really does just completely sort of smash the dynamics and turns that into, you know, a completely flat signal. That's why, you know, too much limiting, too much compression on your music can mean that everything's kind of flat and undynamic. What we've got to do is really play this balancing act between compressing and limiting things, so we can kind of even out dynamics and get a good loudness overall. But we don't want to totally get rid of all of our dynamics, because then we're going to have a lack of punch and clarity to our sounds. But just here, this is extreme limiting. You can see how hard that is actually limiting those dynamics. Okay, so let's look how we could use SKYE Dynamics on something like a drum bus. So what I've got here is a classic break, which, as you can kind of see and hear, is very dynamic. It's also got quite a lot of noise on the quieter sections, so we can use our SKYE Dynamic processor to kind of clean up this break for kind of use in more modern music. So to start off, let's use the expander. So the expander, I'm going to bring in the ratio on my expander here. What's that I've grabbed there? The compressor. Let's just bring that compressor threshold to the top for now. And yes, this is, as I bring this up, you'll hear what happens. It's beginning to work similar to how a gate would work, where anything below that threshold is now turned down, and the louder parts are coming through. So that's really tightened up this break, hasn't it? It's really got rid of that noise in between. And we can just hear it really extreme. Just letting the loudest parts, the kick and the snare, the hi-hats are barely making it through now. But if we set this nicely, we can tighten this break up really well. We could, let's just actually do it extreme and turn off the manual release mode. And here I could adjust the release as much to taste I wanted. So you can hear a little more release on each hit. Let's turn it back to manual mode. It was doing a nice job. And then, what's so cool about this is it's running straight into the compressor. So now we could shape our individual drum hits the same way as I showed you with the white noise demonstration. So if we bring down our threshold, turn up our ratio, you can hear that slightly squeezing those hits now. Let's do it extreme so you can really hear it. Beginning to turn them down there. You can see how that moves our ratio a little bit there. Open up the attack, let some of the transients through. You can hear that sort of pumping effect. Like I say, it's pretty extreme, so I'm just going to back that off a little bit. My expander. And let's just limit it as well. So here's the limiter. This is just going to bring this down, which is just going to set a upper threshold. And then we can turn the whole thing up with using this. Like I said, so it's quite choppy now because of the way we've used the expander, but it's really cleaned it up and made it quite punchy. Listen to that with and without. So previously had the processing. So we could chill out, make it less choppy, less ratio, maybe a little more release on my. You can hear that noise coming up now. So it's a balancing act, isn't it, between this, and usually I'll probably be layering this over with some other drums, so, you know, which cover up that choppiness, and that kind of, those gaps actually that kind of create really interesting rhythmic kind of elements, especially when layered with other drums. So I kind of. Okay, now let's look how we could use SKYE Dynamics to kind of shape individual hits and recordings. So what I've done here, I've simply recorded a hand clap in, okay? And honestly, I just used my microphone from my Mac. So, you know, it's a kind of a bad recording, to be honest with you. So have a listen, we'll hear. You can hear there's a lot of noise, and you know it's very dynamic. You can see that this transient here is very hard and sharp, and the tail quickly descends off. So what we can use SKYE Dynamics to really clean this up and make it a useful sound that we could use in our production. So if I switch on SKYE Dynamics, first thing I'm going to do is use the expander to attempt to get rid of this noise. So let's bring the ratio in. There we are, look. That's got rid of all of that noise and just now letting through. And the auto release mode has done a really nice job actually of making that sound pretty natural. Should we try some others? Let's listen to the natural. Transparent. Smooth. So like I said, that auto release has done a really nice job of making that sound like a pretty natural clap. And now we can use the compressor to kind of even out the dynamics of it. So let's go to the compressor and we're going to give ourselves some ratio. And we're going to bring the threshold down here. You can hear that beginning to compress it. I'm going to open up the attack a bit more to let through some of that first transient. There we are. Now let's have a little look. If I freeze this and create a new audio track, I'm going to copy this down so we can just have a look at the difference. Here is the original. You can see the noise and the kind of hard transient and a tail quickly dropping off. Whereas here's our new processed version, no noise at all, and the dynamics have been evened out a lot here. You see this, the difference between this first transient and the tail is now less. So it means we can turn this sound up more in our productions, and I think it just sounds like a more useful sound. And we could then add other processing to it, like things like reverb. So let's just pop on a reverb, shall we? I'm going to go for the hybrid. Pop on a hybrid reverb. Might just use, that could be very useful in some sort of tracks. Just going to turn off the algorithmic and just use this early reflection. And that's going to give us a really natural sounding clap. Okay, so now I'd like to show you how we can use SKYE Dynamics on our mastering chain. You know, effectively it is a mastering chain because we've got the expander, the compressor, and the limiter all built into one plugin. So I'm going to start off, I've got this track here. I'm going to start off by setting my limit actually. So if I go to my limiter, I'm going to bring this, and you can see how much gain reduction is happening on the limiter here in this red. And it's doing about 2-ish. setting that limit, and now I'm going to go back to my compressor, turn up my ratio, about 2, and bring the threshold down. You should hear, particularly the drums, the louder parts will begin to get turned down slightly. So have a listen. Now I've compressed that top kind of half, what I can then do with my limiter is I can kind of turn up slightly more into the limiter. Turn up my output gain. Heavily compressed master. I'll turn off SKYE Dynamics a second to get the difference. Turn it back on. With my setting so extreme, you can really hear the pumping effect we're getting. If I can chill that out by backing off my ratio a bit and chilling out how much the threshold is hitting it. So again, without. So you can see how this process is giving us a lot of loudness on our track. Okay, so let's have a little look now how we can kind of use SKYE Dynamics across essentially a whole track to shape the sound. So we've been primarily through the demonstrations looking at kind of how to use this in kind of mixing terms and mastering, but we can use it creatively as well using sidechain. So I've got 3 elements here. I've got some drums, I've got a pad, and I've got a bass. Let's have a listen. So let's just revisit our drums quickly with the way we've been using it, just to maybe get a little bit more punch out of our drums. So I'm going to use, first of all, the expander, just to tighten it up slightly. Then I'm going to add a little bit of the compression. So let's bring down the threshold, turn up our ratio. Open up our attack a little bit. Turn on the makeup gain a bit so we get a bit of loudness out of it. So without. See, I've got a little bit more punch and kind of clarity out of the drums there using the SKYE Dynamics. Now this pad, we're going to try, I'm also going to stop the bass so we can really hear this pad. We're going to do a bit of sidechain here, and we're going to get the pad to kind of duck from the input from the drums. So if I, on my pad, turn on my SKYE Dynamic, and then sidechain here, I'm selecting my drums track. And let's have a look at SKYE Dynamics opened up. I've actually got some settings already on here, so I'm just going to back them off and redo them for you. So we are going to sidechain to the compressor. So you can see the signal coming in is from the drums now. So as I begin to turn my ratio right up so we can hear it, bring my threshold down, you can really hear that affecting without. Hear that ducking and giving a rhythmic kind of element to our pad. And how extreme on that, we could back off the threshold a little and the ratio. We can also play around with the attack and release. Maybe the volume up a little bit. So giving a more rhythmic element where as those main hits, the kicks and snares hit, it ducks away our pad and gives us quite an interesting effect. Now on the bass, I'm going to try and do almost like the opposite. So what I'm going to do with the bass is we're going to turn on SKYE Dynamics. We're going to select in the sidechain input here, we're going to select the drums. So the drum input, and we're going to use the expander here to trigger the bass along with the parts. So at the moment it's a long held kind of respace note, which is great, but maybe for a variation or maybe for a new idea we're going to use the expander to trigger as those hits hit. So let's turn up the ratio amount and then we'll bring our threshold up. Oh, I hadn't linked it here. I was thinking what's going on there. So yeah, I've got to link my expander here to the sidechain. There we are. You can hear there, every time the drum hit, the louder drum hits, the kick and the snare hit, it lets through a little bit of our bass. Now it's a very small amount because I've set this quite extreme, but what we can do is we can play around with the release settings. So I'm going to turn off auto mode and then give myself a bit more release. So tight. Mess with the threshold a bit. And I'll give myself a little more volume. So there you can really hear how, using SKYE Dynamics, I've got like a really interesting, more rhythmic elements. First of all, the pad is kind of ducking out the way when the drum hits, whereas the bass is coming through and hitting as those drum hits happen. And of course I've got a SKYE Dynamics on the master as well here, doing a bit of limiting and a bit of compression. So I hope that shows you kind of what a versatile tool this is, with the expander, compressor and limiter all rolled into one. They can work really well together. First of all, for mixing and mastering purposes, for sound design and shaping of like individual transients and hits, but also side chaining for creative use of triggering from external sources, rhythmic elements to then trigger pads and bass, as I have done in this example.